There is a woman in Iowa who has been held at knifepoint 3 times. She was robbed at gunpoint once in a parking lot late at night alone. She has been approached by strangers who told her in explicit terms what they intended to do to her. And every single time, she felt nothing. Not courage, not resolve, not the suppression of panic. Nothing. Her heart did not accelerate. Her palms did not sweat. She did not experience the electric surge of adrenaline that rewires the human body for one singular purpose: survival. She simply stood there, present, calm, curious even. And the researchers who study her cannot decide whether she represents the next stage of human evolution or a profound and terrifying malfunction buried deep inside the human brain. Most people believe fear is a weakness, that the goal of a life well lived is to eliminate it, to become the person who feels nothing when they step to the edge, to transcend the animal panic that makes ordinary people flinch, retreat, hesitate. Thousands of books have been written to that premise. Entire philosophical movements have orbited it. The cultural mythology of the warrior, the stoic, the enlightened mind, all rest on the assumption that fear is the enemy. The research disagrees. The research suggests something far more unsettling. That fear is not a flaw in the human system. It is the human system. And when it disappears, completely, structurally, neurologically disappears, what remains is not freedom. What remains is something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like a person, and from the inside is something else entirely. To understand this, you have to go back much further than medicine. You have to go back to a world where the distinction between predator and prey was not an abstraction, where the difference between a rustle in the grass and silence was not a matter of philosophy. It was the entire calculation of whether you lived until morning. Every organism that exists today is the descendant of something that ran. That is not a metaphor. It is the literal arithmetic of survival. Every creature alive right now exists because at some critical moment in its lineage, an ancestor detected danger and responded before the danger resolved itself. The ones who hesitated are not represented in the genetic record. They left no descendants to wonder about them. Fear, in this sense, is not a psychological state. It is a 400-million-year-old inheritance. It is older than language, older than memory, older than the parts of the brain that produce self-awareness. It is the oldest operating system the living world has ever produced. And in that one woman in Iowa, it is simply gone. Her name, in the scientific literature, is SM. Researchers have been studying her since the early 1990s. She is, by all accounts, warm, sociable, cooperative. She has a sense of humor. She engages thoughtfully with questions. She is in every observable social dimension a person. What she is missing is a structure approximately the size and shape of an almond, located deep within the medial temporal lobe of the brain, the amygdala. In her case, it was destroyed not through injury, but through a condition called Urbach-Wiethe disease, a rare genetic disorder that, in some individuals, causes calcium deposits to gradually accumulate in soft tissue. In SM's case, those deposits settled in both amygdalae with a precision that no surgeon could replicate. The structure was not damaged. It was erased. What followed was not what anyone expected. The assumption, before researchers spent serious time with SM, was that a life without fear might be a life of recklessness. That without the alarm system, the person would simply walk into traffic, provoke strangers, ignore hazards. That assumption was partly right, in ways far more subtle than anyone anticipated. SM does not experience the anticipatory dread that keeps most people at a safe distance from the edge of a cliff. She has been documented approaching snakes directly, creatures that reliably trigger automatic recoil responses in the vast majority of humans, with open, unguarded curiosity. She has walked into situations that activated every social warning signal available to a normal observer without registering any of those signals herself. But the researchers noticed something more disturbing than recklessness. They noticed absence. Not the absence of specific fears, but the absence of the entire emotional terrain that fear normally illuminates. The amygdala does not simply generate the sensation of being afraid. It performs a function that is harder to name and far more fundamental. It evaluates relevance. It scans the environment and separates what matters from what is not. It assigns weight to incoming information based on threat, on stakes, on consequence. Without it, the world becomes flat, not peaceful, not serene, flat. In one experiment, researchers exposed SM to a series of emotionally charged stimuli. Images, sounds, scenarios designed to produce measurable psychological responses. Most individuals, when shown imagery associated with danger, exhibit detectable physiological shifts before they are consciously aware of having processed the image. SM showed nothing. Then the researchers tried something different. They took her to a pet store that sold exotic reptiles. She walked directly to the snake enclosure, pressed her face close, reached in. The researchers asked her afterward whether she had felt anything. She said she felt interested. Interested. That single word haunted the literature for years. Because interest is not a survival response. Interest is what happens after you have already decided you are safe. And SM had made that determination. Not through assessment, not through the conclusion of a risk calculation, but because she was constitutionally incapable of beginning one. SM was considered an anomaly for decades. Then, in the mid-2010s, researchers encountered something that complicated the picture considerably. They found SM again, except this time in the presence of carbon dioxide. When she inhaled air enriched with CO2, a stimulus that triggers a suffocation response in the brainstem, a primitive subcortical alarm that bypasses the amygdala entirely. SM panicked. For the first time in her documented history, she felt fear. She described it later as overwhelming, disorienting. She did not have the emotional scaffolding to contextualize the experience because she had never felt it before, not in any form she could recognize or process. The researchers sat with that data for a long time because what it revealed was not simply that SM could feel fear under the right conditions. It revealed that there are multiple fear systems operating simultaneously in the human brain, and that the amygdala is not the only one. There is a deeper system, older, more primitive, a system that does not respond to thought or memory or context, a system that responds to chemistry alone. The amygdala, it turns out, is not the origin of fear. It is the interpreter. It is the system that takes raw physiological alarm and shapes it into something meaningful, into the specific, navigable sensation of being afraid of something. Without it, fear does not disappear. It becomes formless, wordless, a signal without a receiver. And that distinction changes everything we thought we understood. To understand what is actually being lost, you have to understand what the amygdala actually does in real time. When you walk down an unfamiliar street at night, you are not consciously evaluating every shadow. You do not deliberate over each sound. Your amygdala is doing that work for you continuously beneath the surface of awareness, running threat assessments at a speed that conscious cognition cannot approach. A shape in the periphery, a sound slightly outside the pattern of background noise, a face that does not quite fit the social context of the environment. The amygdala catches all of it. And in the fraction of a second before your conscious mind has formed a coherent perception, it has already begun preparing a response. This is called the low road. Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist who mapped much of this architecture, described two pathways by which threat information travels through the brain. The low road goes directly from the sensory thalamus to the amygdala, a crude, fast, imprecise signal that initiates response before analysis. The high road goes through the cortex, processes the information with more precision, and arrives at the amygdala afterward, often with a correction. The low road is faster because it has to be. If you wait for confirmation before you respond, you may not survive long enough to receive it. This is why you flinch before you think. Why you step back before you decide to. Why a curved shape in the grass produces a surge of adrenaline before your brain has confirmed whether it is a branch or a snake. The amygdala does not wait for evidence. It bets on survival. And without it, you wait. Indefinitely. Researchers who have spent time with SM consistently describe a person who is, in many ways, remarkably functional. She has lived a full life. She has maintained relationships. She has navigated a complex social world. But beneath that surface, the costs accumulate in ways that are difficult to quantify and impossible to fully see. She has, on multiple occasions, found herself in situations that most observers would classify as dangerous without registering any of the signals that should have guided her away from them. Not because she made a calculation and chose to remain, but because she never received the information that would have made the calculation possible. There's a difference, subtle but profound, between a person who feels fear and chooses to act despite it, and a person who does not feel fear and therefore has no choice to make. The former is courage. The word exists because the choice is real, because the cost is felt, because something is actually being overcome. What SM experiences is not courage. It is the structural absence of the terrain on which courage occurs. And what the research cannot fully settle is whether that is a gift or a deprivation. This is where the science becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because the popular narrative around fear, reduce it, overcome it, eliminate it, implicitly assumes that a life with less fear is a better life. That the person who does not feel afraid is freer than the person who does. But SM's life complicates that assumption in ways that cannot be argued away. The memories she does not form, because the amygdala plays a critical role in emotional memory consolidation, amplifying the encoding of experiences that carry significant emotional weight, are not simply memories of being afraid. They are memories of significance, of stakes, of the weight of consequences. Without fear, the world does not simply become safer. It becomes equally weighted. Everything arrives with the same tone. The mundane and the dangerous. The trivial and the consequential. The presence of a friend and the approach of a threat. Without the amygdala applying its constant, invisible hierarchy to incoming experience, life does not become more peaceful. It becomes harder to read. Here is the question that the evolutionary record raises and that the research cannot fully answer. If fear is so fundamental to survival, if it is 400 million years old, if it is distributed across multiple redundant systems in the brain, if every organism alive is descended from something that ran, then why does the capacity for fearlessness exist at all? Why does Urbach-Wiethe disease produce individuals like SM, rather than simply failing to produce viable offspring? Part of the answer lies in the architecture of what fear costs. A prey animal in a constant state of threat response is not eating, not reproducing, not exploring the environment for new resources. An animal paralyzed by fear is not surviving. It is merely not dying, which are not the same thing. Evolution did not select for the animal most afraid of everything. It selected for the animal with the most precise fear, the one that knew when to run and when not to. The research on this is fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Studies examining individuals with elevated amygdala reactivity, people who are constitutionally more afraid, who register threat more readily, show a consistent pattern. They are more prone to anxiety disorders, more likely to avoid exploration, more likely to remain in familiar environments, familiar relationships, familiar cognitive territory. They are safer, and they accomplish less. The individuals who venture into unknown environments, who take creative risks, who found cities in unfamiliar territory, who challenge existing power structures. These are not the most fearful members of their societies, but they're also not SM. They are something in between. They feel fear acutely, and they move through it. They have the alarm system and the capacity to override it. They experience the full cost of the risk and proceed anyway. That gap between feeling the fear and acting despite it may be where human civilization was built. The developmental evidence adds another layer to this. Children are not born with fully calibrated fear responses. Infants will reach toward flames, approach the edges of surfaces, engage with strangers without hesitation. The fear system comes online gradually, shaped both by maturation of neural architecture and by experience, by the accumulated lessons of what the world has taught the child to be afraid of. This process is not simply the installation of fears. It is the construction of a model of the world, of what is dangerous and what is not, of what deserves caution and what invites exploration, of the invisible boundaries that structure a safe life. Children who grow up in environments where that calibration is disrupted through trauma, through neglect, through exposure to consistent threat, show measurable differences in amygdala function. Not simply elevated fear, but dysregulated fear, fear that does not respond appropriately to context, that fires when it should not and fails to fire when it should. And the long-term consequences are not simply psychological. They're structural. The brain itself is shaped by the pattern of fears it learns, which means that fear is not just a response to the world. It is a lens through which the world is perceived. Remove the lens, and you do not see more clearly. You simply see differently. There is a thought experiment that the philosopher and the neuroscientist arrive at from opposite directions, but land in the same place. If you removed, with perfect surgical precision, every trace of fear from a human being, not through damage, not through disease, but through deliberate and complete elimination, what would you be left with? The neuroscientist says, a being with severely compromised threat detection, impaired emotional memory, reduced capacity to assign significance to experience, and a flattened affective landscape. The philosopher says something quieter, something that takes longer to say. The philosopher says, a being without stakes. Because fear is not simply about threat. It is about matching. It is the emotional signal that tells you this has consequences, that this moment is not interchangeable with the others, that what you do here will cost something or gain something that cannot be recovered or reclaimed. Without fear, the stakes dissolve. And when the stakes dissolve, choice dissolves with them. Not the mechanical act of selecting between options, but choice in the deep sense, the sense that makes choosing meaningful, the sense that assumes something is actually at risk. The ancient Stoics spent enormous philosophical energy on the question of fear. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, they did not argue that fear should be eliminated. They argued that fear should be directed only at things within one's control. That the sage does not fear death, not because death is not real, but because the sage has separated what can be controlled from what cannot. That distinction requires a fully functional fear system. It requires feeling the pull of the fear and redirecting it through deliberate philosophical practice. It requires, in other words, exactly what SM does not have. The Stoics were not arguing for the absence of fear. They were arguing for a more precise relationship with it. There is a concept in Japanese that has no direct equivalent in English. Mono no iwe, the awareness of impermanence. The bittersweet recognition that things end. That beauty is inseparable from transience. That the cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it falls. It is not a fearful concept in the narrow sense, but it is downstream of fear. It requires the recognition of loss, the anticipation of absence. That fear, at its core, is structured around. The experience of mono-no-aware requires, in some fundamental sense, a functioning amygdala. It requires the capacity to feel the weight of what might not be there tomorrow. Researchers studying the aesthetic and emotional lives of individuals with amygdala damage consistently note a pattern. The emotional responses to beauty, to loss, to transience, to the awareness that things end, are diminished. Not eliminated, but diminished. As if the emotional register that allows a human being to feel moved by the passage of time is connected, at a neural level, to the same system that alerts them to danger. As if wonder and dread share the same architecture. As if, and this is the thought that the research keeps circling without ever quite articulating, the capacity to be afraid is the same capacity that allows a human being to find anything beautiful at all. The last time researchers formally interviewed SM about her condition, they asked her whether she wished she could feel fear. She said she wasn't sure. She said she had been told, many times, that she should have been afraid in certain situations, that she understood intellectually what the appropriate response would have been, that she had learned to read fear in other people, in the widening of eyes, the retraction of the body, the change in vocal register, as a kind of second language. But she could not feel it. She said the closest approximation she could offer was this. Sometimes, when she was in a situation that she had been told should have been frightening, she felt a kind of increased attention, a heightened awareness, an orientation toward what was happening. Not fear, but something adjacent to it, something that arrived in its shape without its substance. The researchers noted this carefully, because what SM was describing, without knowing the technical vocabulary for it, was orientation without valence, attention without emotional weight, the direction of awareness without the signal that tells you whether what you are attending to matters. She was describing a mind that could look at anything and could not tell the difference between what was dangerous and what was not. There's a version of the future imagined in certain corners of neuroscience and in almost every corner of science fiction, where the fear system is modified, calibrated, tuned to eliminate chronic anxiety, to reduce the ambient dread that haunts millions of human beings who live in objectively safe environments while feeling perpetually threatened. The appeal is obvious. The suffering is real. The epidemic of anxiety disorders, of post-traumatic stress, of chronic fear responses operating in bodies that are not actually in danger. These are genuine and devastating. The desire to find a pharmacological, neurological, or technological intervention is not merely a fantasy. It is a serious scientific project, but the research keeps returning to the same place. The same quiet, uncomfortable realization that the fear system is not simply an alarm that can be silenced without consequence. It is woven into the fabric of what it means to have a self, to have preferences, to have stakes, to have the felt sense that some things matter more than others, to grieve, to love, to find something beautiful in the knowledge that it will not last. SM lives. She is not suffering, at least not in any way she can detect, but she also cannot detect it, and that is precisely the problem. The horror of a life without fear is not that it ends badly. It is that it ends the same way it began, without weight, without consequence, without the knowledge that anything was ever at stake. We carry fear with us the way we carry breath, unconsciously, continuously, without examining it, assuming it will always be there. Perhaps it was only ever meant to be invisible, not eliminated, not transcended, simply trusted. The oldest intelligence the living world has ever produced, running quietly beneath everything, keeping the lights on,